It's our great pleasure to welcome to our 2021 Online Trend Summit a chef who's challenging the stereotypes and reinterpreting what we think of as Indian cuisine in the UK. Welcome, Chef Patron of BiBi, Chetan Sharma. Chet, it's a great pleasure to have you join us today.
Oh yeah, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Obviously, there are a number of cuisines that are at really exciting intersections in their evolution, and Indian cuisine is most definitely one of them. Hence the reason for inviting you to join us today. And I've had the great pleasure of eating at BiBi recently, so I'm really excited to talk to you about how you've got to this point, you know, what's serving as your inspiration, how you're reinterpreting what Indian cuisine is, or, you know, the cooking methods, ingredients, and much, much more. So really looking forward to getting into that. Just a note to participants, if you're joining today as a Trend Hub subscriber, you can discover more about the topics that are going to be covered in this discussion in our 2022-23 Cuisines and Ingredients Trends Framework, and also in the 22-23 food and beverage mega trends under the trend Respect, under the sub-trends of analog cooking, and the mega trend Go For It under the sub-trend Flavor First. So without further ado, Chet, if it's okay, let's dive in. I mean, I'm really keen to obviously talk about BiBi, but can you share with us a bit about your kind of rich and varied journey that has brought you to this point where you're now at BiBi? You've worked with some incredible people, had all sorts of experiences along the way. So yeah, could you just bring that to life a bit for us?
Yeah, so I guess it's been a slightly unusual path. I mean, I got into kitchens when I was around 17, before attending university. Always, would go to university, but was keen to understand a little bit more about. At that time, a subject I was interested, but maybe not super passionate about. Just wanted to know more about food in general. But I got bitten pretty quickly, so decided to spend pretty much every spare moment I had outside of my studies in restaurants. And the great thing when you say to some of the chefs that I worked for early on, people like Atul Kochhar and Giorgio Locatelli, hey, I'll come by and peel green beans for free. They're very happy to have you in, sure. and also give you a lot more responsibility than that as well. So it was pretty quick to go from being a stage to commis to CDP level. But doing everything sort of part-time alongside my studies. And then when it came to the end of that period, it was definitely a fork in the road at that stage. Do I go down the academic route, or do I go into something which was then becoming an obsession as much as a passion? And I chose to go down the latter, at which point I joined Marguerite's out in San Sebastian. Wow. Eventually coming back to the UK to work for Simon Rogan for a little while, opening Ferret at Claridge's, which was a great thing to be involved in at such an early stage. Wow, in my career. And then since then, it's been a mix of consulting, so working with the Ledbury, working with more Hall, but also more accessible brands like Brewdog and Flatiron. Yeah. Eventually ending up as the group development chef for JKS Restaurants.
What a journey to this point! And can I ask you what your studies were actually? Because I think that's quite an interesting kind of reference point in your journey as well. It gives you a really interesting context to food and drink.
Yeah, so my undergraduate studies were in pharmacology, initially starting in medicinal chemistry, but funny enough, I hated the physical chemistry side of that so much that I ended up going down the biological route. But somehow Sod's Law meant that by the time I was actually doing my master's and then later my PhD, I'd gone full circle back into actually studying physics for my PhD. Right. So yeah, I think sciences is probably a good way to sum it up.
So you're at this point, you've opened BiBi. I'm really interested to understand how you describe what it is that you're doing. What is it you're kind of setting out to be, I suppose?
Yeah, I think in many ways, as with lots of young restaurants, I mean, we are at the time of recording this, I think we've just finished our first month of trading. Yeah. So very early doors. And I think we're still finding our feet in many ways as to what we are and what we're trying to do. What I do know is that at the moment, there is lack on the international scene of a progressive Indian restaurant. Yes, we've got great Indian food, classic Indian food at places like Gymkhana, here in London. But we've not seen somebody who's really trying to go that next step in the evolution of Indian cuisine, which is, yes, using, of course, fantastic spices from India, but also being produce led with what's available in the country we're in. And, I think we have the best seafood in the world in the UK. So, how do we then use spices to re-emphasize that point and come back to making the product more delicious rather than masking it?
How do you think to this point then Indian cuisine has kind of sat in the cuisine construct in the UK? You see French cuisine and Japanese cuisine being taken to the next level. What's hiding within Indian cuisine?
Yeah, I think in some ways, even the phrase or the idea of Indian cuisine is like saying European cuisine. So I think we need to remember the scale of the country is. I always give the example of the distance from London to Istanbul is the same as from Kashmir to Kerala. So, India it's a vast country. So they have like micro cuisines, and they have, forget the idea of, from neighbor to neighbor, but from state to state, it's hugely different as well. So I think one of the things that we want to look at a little bit more is getting people to really come to grips with the fact that, Indian food is not really a thing, in the way that we have North and South Italian cooking, and you might have Sicilian cooking. We want to get to that level of sort of micro regionality with Indian cuisine. We are a restaurant that very much focuses on pan-Indian cooking. My background in terms of my family is North Indian, but we definitely explore flavors from all over the place. And also start looking a little bit more at the historical links and where the foods come from as well, because for most people, when they think of Indian food, they think of curries that are cooked with tons of, chili and tomatoes. And, when you start thinking, actually, none of that stuff existed in India until about 400 years ago. And there's a history of, 4,500 years of cooking in India. Not to say that you won't use tomatoes or chilies, far from it. But it gives you an idea of the scale of the variety of the cuisine as well. Well, one of the many reasons we named the restaurant BiBi. So BiBi means lady of the house in Punjabi, the language that my family speaks. So I was definitely led in the sort of creative process by sort of recipes and ideas that my grandmother handed down. And they both grew up on farms in India. They were both very, very frugal, very resourceful people. And also very, very, very seasonally led, as you have to be when you grow up on a farm.
Of course.
So that's kind of the approach that we're taking, is that actually, we've got a really popular dish on the menu this week, which unfortunately is going to have to come off because we're out of sweet corn season now. That's I guess that's the slight drawback to this kind of model. But it is also exciting that, okay, we're coming into October, November, like an artist having a new set of paints to work with. So every month, every couple of weeks, we get new toys to play with, really.
And when you're talking about that sweet corn dish, is that the kukuri that I would have tried? Absolutely incredible. The spicing on that was mouth-watering, and the sensory side of things, unbelievable. It felt simple but very clever at the same time.
I think, and thank you. I think a lot of what we do at BiBi is about hidden technique. When you see those balls of the kurkure, for example, they're just balls with sweet corn inside them. But as you mentioned, there's a relatively complex spice mix with around 23, 25 ingredients in there. Really heavy with things like dehydrated green mango, which brings that sort of sourness, and a bit like when you eat, kurkure are essentially Indian knickknacks. So when you eat a knickknack, you get the sticky bits on your fingers. That's the kind of approach we're trying to take with it. And we make a mayonnaise that's made with all of the trim from the sweet corn as well. So we boil the cobs, we make an oil with the husks, and then we make a mayonnaise out of that. So it's really it's a nice dish to talk about as an example of what we're doing at BiBi, which is using the whole animal, using the whole plant, being seasonally led, but still delivering sort of nostalgic Indian flavors.
And that was one of the things that really struck me, is the kind of nostalgic Indian flavors, but everything else actually it felt like it had been reinterpreted from the decor to the the setting itself, the fact you're using different kind of cooking methods, the presentation. I knew I was in an Indian restaurant because of what I was eating, but everything else was challenging my preconceptions, which was, yeah, I guess what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, we were very, very conscious when we designed the space. We've taken lots of nods from actually my maternal grandmother's farmhouse in the way that we've designed the space. But really, in many ways, it shouldn't be immediately obvious that you're in an Indian restaurant when you come into BiBi, because what you're not getting is an immediately obvious Indian meal. You know, we play old school R&B and hip hop. We have abstract art on the walls. The whole experience is supposed to actually in some ways be a little bit confusing. Restaurants shouldn't take themselves too seriously. Yes, there's a lot of technique behind what we do. I mean, I think what was really nice was having one of my old bosses and mentors in sort of the first week of opening, when Brett Graham came in and was asking me questions about you know, oh, how did you get the beef to taste like this, and what did you do there, and what did you do with that? So I guess it reaffirmed that we're going in a good direction in terms of the dishes are complex, that, you know, one of the best chefs in Britain is asking a question as to how we're achieving what we're doing. But at the same time, it looks simple, it looks, you know, fun. We take walk-ins, people sit on the bar. The last year and a half that we've had with COVID, with restrictions, lockdowns, you know, the industry going upside down in terms of staffing, all of that stuff. When I think about the kind of restaurant I want to eat in, and that was definitely one of the big directions with BiBi. You know, I think about places that are, yes, technique led, yes, they take their food very seriously, but they don't take themselves seriously. And I hope that's really what guests walk away with in the end, is that, yes, I've had a great meal, a great experience, but this isn't a once in a lifetime thing. This is something I want to do again next Thursday, you know. Of
course, the great thing about this Sigri as well is that because it's open, there's also that theatrical element and that proximity to the cooking experience that you get. I mean, to be honest, anywhere where I would imagine where you sit within the restaurant, but particularly as a counter diner, you've got that immediate interaction, which is mesmerizing.
Yeah, and I think you know, counter dining is still something that you don't see a great deal of in W1 in Mayfair. So it's something that the local clientele are maybe less used to at the moment. But it's for me, if you're talking about, without lecturing, if you're talking about re-educating people on Indian food, being able to demystify it a little bit by being sat on the counter is a really good way to experience it.
Right at the beginning, I talked about being Indian cuisine being at a really exciting kind of intersection or point in its evolution. Where do you see Indian cuisine right now, and what you're doing as part of that evolution, I suppose?
In terms of where we sit on the evolution, I think it's you know, it's a never-ending scale. At the moment, like some people will paint us with the brush of being fusionist restaurants, or, you know, trying to westernize Indian food and things like that, which is definitely not what we're doing. And fusion is such a dirty word, but going back to the example of chilies and tomatoes, you know, there was a time where that would have been considered fusion food and Indian food. So, you know, for me to serve we're doing a jal muri at the moment, which is a traditional puffed rice and mustard oil snack from India. We're doing that with chalk stream trout, the very last of the trout this year. Now, of course, traditionally, you don't have chalk stream trout in India. Of course you don't. But we have lots and lots of river fish, especially in Bengal. And you know, that would sit on a menu with jal muri in many ways, but it wouldn't sit inside a jal muri. Whereas what we're doing is saying, actually, we can skip a stage and say these two things can go really well together. You know, a bit like, I think you had the other day, the scallop nimbu pani dish, which is you know, raw scallops with an Indian lemonade, made with Indian, well, actually sweet lime, it's called Mosambi. And yes, you know, nimbu pani, any Indian person or any person who's traveled through the subcontinent would have had nimbu pani at some point. It's basically, after lassi, probably the second most common drink. And we decided to add scallops to it and serve them raw. So, you know, the inspiration for that dish would definitely be somewhere along the sort of aguachile stroke ceviche route, but which is not traditionally Indian, but we're using very predominantly Indian flavors with great British ingredients. So, you know, put me on that evolution path wherever you want. I just think we're cooking Indian food.
And this is a slightly, I guess, loaded question, but it sort of naturally leads on from what you're talking about. You know, something that's hotly discussed and debated across food at the moment is is authenticity, and therefore what, and it's one of those things, certainly for me, that doesn't necessarily have a right or a wrong answer, but I'm just interested for you and BiBi what authenticity means.
Yeah, so our food doesn't look Indian, is what I'd say.
Yeah.
It doesn't look immediately Indian in the same way that the surroundings don't. Our flavors are authentic. They're true to the Indian palate.
Yeah.
Again, another one of the reasons behind the name BiBi is if an Indian grandmother walks in, and we've been really lucky that we were unsure as to how the sort of older Mayfair Indian crowd would have maybe taken the restaurant.
Yeah.
They've become our most regular visitors. If an Indian grandmother walks in, does she recognize it as Indian? And the resounding answer so far is yes. So I think we've achieved that goal. Yeah, like I say, not it doesn't look necessarily authentic, but the flavors, there's no negotiation on that.
Yeah, which I guess it leads me on to one of the things that struck me, comparing it to perhaps what my reference points would have been to Indian cuisine, and that's the spicing, and certainly feels to me like there's a much greater level of sophistication around spicing, and I'm just wondering from your point of view what your kind of approach to spicing is in the context of flavor.
Yeah, so I'd say our spicing, the ambition is like any good Indian chef, both here and back in India as well, is balance.
Yeah.
Our recipes are undeniably complex in terms of like,
Yeah.
Our garam masala has 20 plus ingredients in it. Our galoti kebab, which I don't know if you tried, but has 60 spices in it.
Yeah.
The idea of using spices with the product is always to emphasize the product, not to emphasize the spice.
Yeah.
Even we have the raw beef pepper fry at the moment, which is all about how great black pepper can be. We have a few variations of black pepper in there. But at the same time, you should also be able to taste the beef. Otherwise, what's the point of using this really great, like heavily aged beef if you're only going to taste spice over it?
Well, I have to say, it just compliment the pepper complemented it beautifully, and you could really detect that kind of matured beef flavor. It really it elevated the beef. But I mean, there's I think, were they fermented peppercorns, telecherry peppercorns, I think.
Yeah, so we work with the farm direct, and they basically lacto ferment green peppercorns for us. Yeah, so they really, I describe them as a cross between a peppercorn and a caper.
Yeah.
They're very bright, very zingy, but also carry good heat behind them as well. And I think I'd like to say any dish on the menu is a good example of what we're trying to achieve, but the pepper fry is probably a really good one as well, because it does still carry spice. It's not subtle, it's not delicate, but it's balanced, and I think that's the key.
Yeah. And I mean, just from talking to you so far, it feels like you're exploring a whole new level of richness within Indian ingredients, particularly spices. Do you think there's so much more to be discovered, and actually what we're familiar with at the moment is just very much the top line, that there's so much more richness to go after?
I mean, I would say, even as a chef who's been lucky to work in some very, very good restaurants, even now at this stage, when I'd like to put myself close to the forefront of this sort of new wave of Indian restaurants, I probably know somewhere between 5 and 10% of the wildest spice. Like, there's a long, long, long way to go. And I'd say previous to that, when I was working at sort of 2 Michelin star level, in world 50 best restaurants and all that kind of thing, I'd probably say I knew about 1% of spice. There's so much to unlock. There's so much to unlock.
And I guess that richness varies by region or state as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the fascinating thing for me is that, even at BiBi now, we source from as much as possible directly from farmers or directly from cooperatives in India.
Yeah.
We get our cinnamon comes from one place, which comes from Sri Lanka. Our cassia barks comes from way up near Sikkim, which is right at the other end of India.
Yeah.
Then our cassia leaves come from Nagarcoil in Tamil Nadu. So it's 3 products which are actually from the same genus, from the same tree,
Yeah.
They come at different qualities at different altitudes and different sort of temperature conditions and humidity conditions. So to source the best of everything, even from one plant, we can't just say all the best cinnamon grows in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Because you need cinnamon, you need cassia, and you need cassia leaves, and those three are really important in Indian cuisine.
I guess part of your conscience is around impact, and therefore how are you kind of navigating those choices when it comes to, you know, from a sustainability perspective with what you're doing at BiBi?
Yeah, so we don't source any fresh produce outside of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best we can do at the moment. Unfortunately, we're not quite at the global warming hasn't turned it so that you can grow black peppercorns down in Cornwall just yet. But no, of course, I joke about it, but it's very, very important. The products we use in the kitchen are British based. You know, all of our seafood, all of our meat, all of our veg as well. Even our quote unquote exotic veg comes from Britain. Wherever it's possible. You know, even our okra is British at the moment. And as soon as that's not possible, we'll take it off the menu. The only exception on the fresh produce side is, I mean, it's passion fruit season in India now. So we are sourcing our passion fruit from, but again, we're not quite at the stage where we can get it down in Cornwall just yet.
Not quite. I know when you and I have chatted before, you've talked about some, you know, the choices around some of the different grains and different rices that you've used, and I guess part of that is about exploring a different ingredient base and the interest and the intrigue that comes around that. But also, is there perhaps an environmental choice as well around some of those ingredients?
Absolutely. I think rice is a really good example. I mean, I've not had the courage yet to completely ban rice from our restaurant. Though again, giving you an idea of how wide the scope of Indian cuisine is, we basically never ate rice growing up because our family comes from a wheat and maize growing part of the country.
Okay.
So that, you know, if you say to somebody that, oh, you're Indian, but you don't eat coconuts or rice, that's it's a pretty good indication of how different Indian cuisines can be. But the rice that we typically use in Indian restaurants and you know, we use it at home as well, but it's basmati is the key variety, and there's a pusa varietal that everybody uses, the main one. The best basmati rice, unfortunately, grows into the Himalayan basin, but the pressure on farmers in order to turn that crop around and then get the wheat crop planted in time means that they're burning all of the husk instead of composting it, instead of reusing it as historically it would have been done. So that's causing major pollution issues, both north and south of that region. So in Delhi, you get loads of smog. So anyone who's been to Delhi will know about the smog problems. And it's also contributing to a temperature rise in the Himalayas itself, because all that smoke has to go somewhere. You know, even if you go to Agra and go and see the Taj Mahal, which is obviously one of the 7 wonders of the world, it's a completely different color to what it was 20 years ago. And that's not only down to rice production, but rice production and poor practices around it have caused that. So for us, it was a case of we're going to serve rice on the menu. We need to source one, a more environmentally friendly rice, and one that's also not necessarily causing as many water drainages as basmati is, because it's a very water intensive crop, which is why it grows well in the valley of a mountain. But you know, the central part of India is already basically a desert. Anyone who's been to Hyderabad or any of that region, Andhra, or that part of the country recently will know that it's not, what's going on there is not okay. So we, partly for that, we look at things like millets and sorghum, which grow much better in those environments. And further south in Wayanad in Kerala, we've got a rice supplier there who grows a varietal called Kaima rice, and they grow it specifically because it is super sustainable, requires very little water. But what that also means is that it's not that sort of 1 inch long, you know, pearl white rice that you see in most Indian restaurants. It's a little bit grubby, it's harder to clean, it's harder to cook with, but still has all the aroma, all the flavor, and I think a more interesting texture for what we use it for. And then for our more sort of seasonally driven rices, so again, the history of basmati rice is that you basically can't eat a basmati that's less than 2 years old. In many cases, the best stuff is 36 months plus. I would say it's akin to, Parmesan cheese. You don't want to eat it when it's young. But our fresh rices, so at the moment we are getting them from Assam, which is way out in the northeast, from a lady called BiBi. That'll stop soon because she's nearly run out. And then we'll source from closer to Bengal, to Calcutta, a Govinborg variety. Now, I've just named 4 or 5 varieties of rice. I think anybody at the summit would probably be quite interested to know that there are 128,000 varieties of Indian rice.
Goodness me! Wow.
Yeah. So we've got backups, if doesn't work out.
Plenty to go at. And I assume you'll tell that story and that narrative when those different rices, those seasonal rices, come onto the menu, and that will be part of the experience, I guess.
Well, it's really difficult to strike the balance in a restaurant. You want to be pioneering, and you want to change trends, and you want to change the way that people look at a certain cuisine or a pocket of the cuisine. But if you're out for dinner with your missus, you're not really that fussed about the story behind the rice.
Sure.
In most cases. In some cases, yes, of course. And it's great when we have chefs sat on the counter, because they'll ask a million questions. But for most people, they're like, oh, this is tasty, and that's all that matters. So I think it's really important that, yes, we want to be sustainable, and we are putting practices into place that mean that we're hopefully leading on that front, definitely as far as sort of Indian restaurants go. But generally, in terms of wild cuisine, hopefully we're of course, I think the name everyone thinks of is silo at the moment, but we want to get to that stage as our restaurant grows more and more. So I think the work we're doing there is great. But reality is, people also have an expectation that when they come to a Mayfair restaurant, they want a certain cut of meat, or they want a certain vegetable. They want truffles, which aren't necessarily unsustainable, but they're just not available year round. So there's bits and pieces that we want to put into place to help that process, while also just making sure that the restaurant is delicious and enjoyable, and the kind of place that people want to go back to.
No, brilliant. I would definitely see you part of a set of chefs that are challenging norms and reinventing cuisines. Another example, actually, who presented at our culinary congress a few years ago would be Jeremy Chan at Ikoy. I don't know if you would agree, and if you do, for me to put you in that bracket, who else would you see in that set, perhaps? And I suppose, really importantly, what do you see as the kind of common ground there? What's the thing that would unite you all, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, look, to be put in the same category of Jeremy at this stage is amazing. He's a phenomenal chef. And Ikoyi is a fantastic restaurant. And he's got a few years head start on me in terms of running the restaurant. But no, his way of looking at food is unique, very, very unique. So I'd say, to be honest with you, yes, I'd say Jeremy, my old Margaret's classmate, Santi over at Cole, is definitely one of them. John Chantarasak, who's going to open the Anglo-Thai restaurant next year. Just knowing the style of food that he's doing, and Kim, who's working alongside him, who's ex Royal Hospital Road, just knowing the style of food that the two of them are going to be doing is super, super exciting. I'd say those are the guys that you look at in many ways, alongside, maybe like Sebi Holmes, who's over at Farang as well. People are really exploring world cuisines in a very different way, and putting their own interpretations and their own sort of seasonal twists and British twists on them. So I would say those are when I think of who in a few years' time I'd look at as like my contemporaries within the space. And
I know it's a little bit early to say. You've only been opened at the point of recording about a month, but what do you see as the next challenge? What comes after this?
The real difficulty isn't opening well. It's setting a standard and continuing to meet it day in, day out. That sort of consistency. Whereas when you look at restaurants like, I'm going to mention a JKS one here. When you look at a restaurant like Gymkhana, which was top of its game 8 years ago when it opened, and still, for most people, even traveling through India, people mention it as their favorite Indian restaurant in the world. That's the goal, is be great in 5 years' time. It's nice to be good now, and I think we're okay at the moment, but to be really, really held in high esteem for the next 5 years is the challenge. I also make no secret of it. I think in the long term, I mentioned it right at the top of this, there is no international Indian chef at the moment and no international presence. You know, you look at things like Koya and Rocker and Zuma and those kind of groups, and the guys who've managed to spread their wings, you know, not just to the Middle East, but also to New York and Miami and all these different cities. And I think, you know, the near universal popularity of Indian food, it's really surprising to me that nobody's ever been able to do it. I mean, I'm not to say, it doesn't say I will be the person to do it. Maybe it'll be the person after me who does it. But I feel like we've got a good opportunity to really spread our wings out with this as well.
And I think the really exciting thing is that you see the potential in the cuisine, or the cuisines of India, to be able to do that. And as you say, when you look at the world stage, it is surprising that it hasn't been done. But yeah, that's where the opportunity is, I guess.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, one of the big things for me was, you know, even I'm relatively late to the game in terms of Indian cooking. A lot of chefs of my generation or before, you know, you were told that if you wanted to be taken seriously as a chef, you go and work in French kitchens, or you go work in European kitchens. And that was the path that I took for a very long time as well. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that, you know, I was maybe naive in not really understanding the complexities of Indian cuisine and just how great it can be when it's done properly. But yeah, I think hopefully now the next generation of young Indian chefs coming through, or British Indian chefs, stop looking over to sort of France and Spain for inspiration and look back towards home for a better idea of what can be done.
Well, certainly from a dining experience and sitting on the other side of the counter, you've definitely got that one ticked. I mean, it's been a huge pleasure to speak to you today. A great pleasure to dine with you the other day, and a big thank you for the Food People and the 2021 Summit audience for inspiring us and sharing with us just the story so far. And your reinterpretation of Indian food, challenging the reference points. I think it's a really, really exciting place to be, really thought-provoking. And yeah, thank you very much on behalf of the entire audience for joining me today to talk about it.
Fantastic, and thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.